Right, now still on the passing of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, we speak to Vasu Gounden from the African Centre for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. Good evening, thanks for joining us here on eNCA. What is your reaction to the death of Kofi Annan? Good evening, can you hear me?
I can hear you, good evening.
What is your reaction to the death of Kofi Annan?
Well, I think we were quite saddened by the death of Kofi Annan. He was one of the most significant Secretary Generals of the United Nations. He presided over, during his tenure as head of the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations, he presided over the Rwandan genocide, and in his tenure as UN Secretary General, he presided over the events of 9/11. So his leadership was over many significant events and developments in the world. He will be most significantly remembered for his document in larger freedom towards development, security, and human rights for all, which was a seminal document presented to world leaders to deal with halving poverty by 2015, also with ending war and terrorism and promoting human dignity. And I think this is something that Kofi Annan will always be remembered for. We will miss his presence in the world. He was the epitome of the global civil servant, somebody who served the United Nations for 4 decades. And I think significantly was the first and only person that was recruited from within the system to serve the United Nations. And that was reflected, I think, in the way he conducted himself on the global stage, particularly from our perspective, his contribution to peacemaking and peace building globally.
Now, of course, Kofi Annan got the top job at the UN during Nelson Mandela's presidency here in South Africa, 2 high-profile African leaders taking on the world stage. How important was that for Africa at the time?
Well, I think significantly, they were not just 2 African statesmen, but also 2 African statesmen who were Nobel Peace Prize winners significantly. And on this year of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, I think as we celebrate his death, we should also celebrate the life of Kofi Annan as well.
Now, talk to us about Kofi Annan's style of diplomacy. He's often referred to as gentle, almost as if from a forgotten era, if you look at the world these days.
Well, I don't think that one can think of Kofi Annan from a forgotten era. I think there were many things that he put in place, the foundations for the reform of the United Nations, the foundations for ending terrorism and dealing decisively with terrorism and with war. His opposition to the Iraq war would go down in history as one of those events in which a United Nations Secretary General defied the major powers of the world and stood fast on principle. And I think those are foundations that are going to hold us in good stead as we have major challenges to the multilateral system currently on the world stage.
What about his legacy there at the UN? How effective was he, one as a peacekeeper, but also with his reform efforts of the UN itself?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
How effective do you think was Kofi Annan with his reform efforts of the UN and the UN structures itself?
I think he was certainly one of the more effective Secretary Generals, certainly during his tenure, both as head of UN peacekeeping as well as the Secretary General of the United Nations. We saw, as I have said, that the foundations having been put in place for the reforms that we are possibly going to see come in the next few years at the United Nations.
Now, of course, Kofi Annan was he was a career diplomat. He joined the UN in the 1960s already. And that's definitely a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom gathered over the years. What did you personally learn from him?
I think for me personally, what I would take away from the life of Kofi Annan is that we need more global civil servants and servants of the people. And he epitomized this, and I think we can all learn from his life. He's the calm way in which he handled global affairs, but yet very decisively, and a man who stood on principle, but was yet flexible on practice.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us this evening here on eNCA. Vasu Gounden, and he's from the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, or ACCORD.